Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that will leave you thinking long after this video ends. We're exploring one of history's most devastating events, a story so powerful that it has echoed through the centuries as both warning and wisdom. This is the fall of Jerusalem, a city that stood as the crown jewel of the ancient world, only to crumble into ash and memory within a single generation. Before we begin this journey together, if you enjoy deep dives into history that reveal timeless truths, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these stories. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always amazed by our global community coming together to explore these incredible narratives. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare to walk through one of the most profound chapters in human history. This isn't just about ancient walls falling or empires clashing. This is about the human heart, about choices that echo through generations, and about warnings that were given, ignored, and ultimately fulfilled with terrifying precision. Tonight, we're exploring the fall of Jerusalem through the lens of Ellen G. White's masterwork, The Great Controversy, one of the most widely read books in Christian literature. Her account weaves together history, prophecy, and spiritual insight in ways that make ancient events feel urgently relevant to our modern world. You'll hear the voices of ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus confirming these events, and you'll see how the patterns of the past mirror the challenges we face today. This is a story about a city that forgot the source of its strength, about leaders who chose pride over wisdom, about warnings that came from heaven itself, and about the tragic consequences when those warnings were dismissed. But it's also about mercy, about preservation, and about how even in the darkest moments of judgment, divine providence ensured that truth would survive. So take a deep breath and let yourself be transported back nearly 2,000 years to a time when Jerusalem stood at the crossroads of destiny, when every choice mattered, and when the fate of a nation hung in the balance. This journey will challenge you, inspire you, and perhaps most importantly, it will hold up a mirror to our own times, inviting us to see the patterns that repeat when humanity forgets the lessons of history. Let's begin. Jerusalem. Even the name carries weight, doesn't it? For thousands of years, this city has been more than just a place on a map. It has been a symbol, a promise, a battleground of the soul. In the first century, Jerusalem stood as the undisputed center of Jewish faith and identity. Its massive stone walls rose like defiant fists against the sky. The temple, rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great, gleamed with gold and marble, visible for miles across the Judean hills. Pilgrims from across the known world made the journey to worship there, to offer sacrifices, to feel the presence of the divine in that sacred space. But beneath the grandeur, something had gone terribly wrong. The city that was meant to be a light to the nations had become a monument to human pride. The people who had been chosen to represent divine principles to the world had drifted so far from their calling that they could no longer recognize truth when it stood before them in human flesh. Ellen G. White captures this tragic irony with profound clarity. She writes about how the proud city, surrounded by walls and fortified with human ingenuity, had forgotten the God who had delivered them. Pride and rebellion had clouded their hearts, and warnings were despised. This wasn't just a religious failing. It was a complete breakdown of the moral and spiritual foundations that had once made Jerusalem great. History bears witness to this decline. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived through these very events, documented the corruption that had infected every level of society. The priesthood, which should have been the guardian of divine law, had become a political prize fought over by ambitious families. The Sanhedrin, the religious council that should have guided the people in righteousness, had become more concerned with maintaining their power and privilege under Roman occupation than with genuine spiritual leadership. The Romans had conquered Judea in 63 BCE, and while they allowed the Jewish people to maintain their religious practices, the occupation was a constant source of tension and humiliation. Many Jews longed for a Messiah, a liberator who would drive out the Romans and restore Israel to its former glory. But their vision of liberation was primarily political and military. They wanted a warrior king who would lead them to victory over their enemies, not a humble carpenter who spoke of loving those enemies and turning the other cheek. White emphasizes that the destruction that would eventually come wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of choices made over decades, even centuries. The sins of leaders and people alike had reached their limit, and judgment fell upon them. This is crucial to understand. The fall of Jerusalem wasn't arbitrary divine wrath. It was the natural consequence of persistent rebellion against known truth, of choosing pride over humility, of elevating human wisdom above divine guidance. The warnings came in many forms. Prophets had spoken for generations about the danger of turning away from God's law. The Hebrew scriptures were filled with accounts of what happened when the people forgot their covenant, when they adopted the practices of surrounding nations, when they placed their trust in political alliances rather than in divine providence. The pattern was clear. Faithfulness brought blessing and protection, while rebellion brought disaster and exile. And then came the ultimate warning, delivered not through a prophet, but by the divine presence itself, walking the dusty streets of Jerusalem. Jesus of Nazareth taught in the temple courts, healed the sick in the narrow alleys, and wept over the city he loved. His words were urgent, his message clear. He spoke of judgment coming, of the temple being destroyed, of a time of tribulation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Matthew's Gospel records one of the most haunting prophecies ever spoken. As Jesus left the temple for the last time, his disciples pointed out the massive stones and magnificent buildings. Jesus responded with words that must have shocked them to their core. "Do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." Later, sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city, Jesus wept. Luke's Gospel captures his anguish. If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. These weren't the words of someone eager for judgment. They were the broken-hearted cries of someone who saw the inevitable approaching and knew that the opportunity for another path was slipping away. White emphasizes this point powerfully. The opportunity for obedience and preservation was real, she writes, yet the city chose to ignore it, setting the stage for a catastrophe that would reverberate through history. The religious leaders who should have recognized the fulfillment of prophecy in Jesus' ministry instead saw him as a threat to their authority. The people who should have welcomed the kingdom of heaven instead clamored for a political revolution. The nation that should have been a beacon of light to the world instead chose darkness, rejecting the very one who had come to save them. But Jesus didn't just prophesy destruction. He also gave his followers clear, practical instructions for how to survive the coming catastrophe. He told them that when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies, they should flee to the mountains. When they saw the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, they should not delay even to go back into their houses to get their belongings. They should pray that their flight wouldn't happen in winter or on the Sabbath, because the need for speed would be urgent. These weren't metaphorical instructions. They were survival guidance for a specific historical event that Jesus knew was coming. And here we see a crucial principle that White emphasizes throughout her work. Even in judgment, mercy provides a way of escape for those willing to obey. God never destroys without warning. He never brings judgment without first offering an alternative path. But that path requires faith, obedience, and often the willingness to look foolish in the eyes of the world. In the years following Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the early Christian community in Jerusalem held onto these warnings. They remembered his words. They taught them to new believers. They waited and watched, knowing that the day would come when they would need to act on faith, abandoning everything familiar for the sake of survival. Meanwhile, the city itself continued its descent into chaos. The brief period of relative peace under Roman governance gave way to increasing unrest. Jewish revolutionaries called zealots began organizing resistance against Rome. Sicarii, dagger-wielding assassins, murdered Roman sympathizers in broad daylight, melting into crowds before they could be caught. The tensions between different Jewish factions became almost as violent as the conflict with Rome itself. Josephus describes this period with vivid, disturbing detail. He writes about how the corruption spread like gangrene through the body politic. Chief priests, who should have been mediating between God and the people, were instead enriching themselves through extortion and violence. The temple, which should have been a house of prayer, had become, as Jesus himself had declared, a den of robbers. The Roman historian Tacitus, though writing from the perspective of the conquering empire, nevertheless confirms the internal strife that weakened Jerusalem from within. He notes the divisions among the Jewish leadership, the competing factions each claiming authority, the breakdown of civil order that made Roman intervention seem almost inevitable. White's inspired insight cuts to the heart of the matter. She frames these events not just as political or military history, but as the playing out of spiritual principles. When a nation, a city, or even an individual persistently rejects divine guidance, when pride replaces humility, when rebellion becomes normalized, the consequences are not merely spiritual. They manifest in very real, very tangible ways in the physical world. The years crept by. The warnings remained unheeded. The Christian community continued to grow, but they remained a small minority in a city dominated by those who had rejected their message. They watched, they waited, they remembered Jesus' words, and they prepared for the day when faith would require them to do something that would seem absolutely crazy to everyone around them. That day was coming. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The choices made by Jerusalem's leaders, by its people, by those who should have known better, were setting in motion events that no human power could stop. The city stood at the edge of an abyss, proud and defiant, unaware that the ground beneath its feet was already beginning to crumble. The road to destruction is rarely traveled all at once. It's a gradual descent marked by small compromises, justified exceptions, and the slow erosion of principles once held sacred. Jerusalem's path to ruin followed this pattern precisely. Each step away from divine guidance seemed reasonable at the time. Each compromise with truth appeared necessary for survival or prosperity. But together, these choices formed a stairway descending into darkness. By the year 66 CE, the situation had reached a breaking point. A series of incidents, each building on the last, finally sparked open revolt. The Roman procurator, Gallus Florus, was notoriously corrupt and cruel, even by the standards of Roman provincial governors. He openly plundered the temple treasury and brutally suppressed any protest. When the people of Jerusalem mocked him by passing around a basket to collect coins for the poor procurator, his response was savage. He unleashed his troops on the city, crucifying even Jews who held Roman citizenship. This atrocity ignited fury throughout Judea. The Zealots, who had been agitating for armed resistance for years, finally found the moment they'd been waiting for. They attacked the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, overran it, and slaughtered the defenders. This wasn't just rebellion. This was a declaration of war against the most powerful military machine the world had ever known. Josephus, who had initially tried to mediate between the rebels and Rome, describes the euphoria that gripped Jerusalem in those early days. The impossible had happened. They had defeated Roman soldiers. Surely this was the beginning of the liberation they'd been praying for. Surely God would now intervene, sending his Messiah to lead them to complete victory. But the Christians in Jerusalem remembered different words. They remembered Jesus saying that when they saw armies surrounding the city, they should flee. They remembered the warning about not one stone being left upon another, and they began to prepare quietly for what they knew was coming. The Roman response was swift and overwhelming. Gallus, the governor of Syria, marched on Jerusalem with a substantial force. He besieged the city, and for a time, it looked as though the revolt would be crushed quickly. The situation became desperate for the defenders. The walls were breached. Roman soldiers fought their way into parts of the city. Victory seemed within Gallus's grasp. And then, inexplicably, he withdrew. Historians have debated this decision for centuries. Some suggest he underestimated the difficulty of taking the entire city. Others point to harassment of his supply lines. Whatever the military rationale, for the Christians watching and waiting, this was the sign they'd been told to watch for. Gallus's retreat created a brief window of opportunity. The siege was lifted. The roads out of the city were temporarily clear. White emphasizes the providential nature of this moment. She writes that not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Those who obeyed the divine warnings were preserved, a living testimony of God's mercy. While the rest of Jerusalem celebrated Gallus's retreat as a miraculous victory, interpreting it as evidence of divine favor, the Christian community saw it differently. They saw it as their moment to escape. In what must have seemed like madness to their neighbors, the Christians left. They abandoned their homes, their possessions, everything they'd built in Jerusalem. They fled to Pella, a city in the Decapolis region beyond the Jordan River. Families packed what little they could carry. Parents led children out of the only home they'd ever known. They left behind relatives who thought they were crazy, friends who couldn't understand why they would flee when victory seemed so close. Imagine that moment. Imagine being part of that community, knowing that everything rational, everything logical, every voice of conventional wisdom said to stay. The siege was over. Jerusalem had been delivered. Why leave now? But they had something more reliable than conventional wisdom. They had a specific word of warning from someone they trusted absolutely. and they chose faith over sight, obedience over comfort, divine guidance over human reasoning. The people of Jerusalem mocked them. Here were the cowards, the faithless ones, abandoning the city in its moment of triumph. Let them go. Jerusalem had no need of those who trusted in a crucified carpenter rather than in the strength of their walls and the courage of their defenders. But the Christians who fled to Pella knew something that Jerusalem didn't. They knew that what looked like victory was actually a brief reprieve before final judgment. They knew that the real danger wasn't past, but was only beginning. They knew that obedience to divine warning, even when it seemed foolish, was the only path to survival. Josephus records what happened next with the detail of an eyewitness, because he was there. He had been appointed as a general in the Jewish resistance, but had been captured by the Romans. Recognizing his knowledge and intelligence, they kept him alive, and he became an observer and chronicler of the terrible events that followed. The Emperor Nero appointed Vespasian, one of Rome's most capable generals, to crush the Jewish revolt. Vespasian approached the task methodically, first subduing the surrounding regions, cutting off support and escape routes, before turning his full attention to Jerusalem itself. But before he could complete the siege, Nero died, throwing Rome into a period of civil war. Vespasian returned to Rome and eventually became emperor himself, leaving his son Titus to finish the job in Judea. Inside Jerusalem, the brief window of unity that the revolt had created shattered completely. Multiple factions, each claiming to represent the true defense of the city, turned on each other with appalling violence. The Zealots, led by John of Gishala, controlled the temple. The Sicarii held the fortress of Masada. Simon Bar Giora commanded another faction within the city. Rather than uniting against the common enemy, they fought each other for control, burning each other's food supplies, murdering suspected collaborators, creating chaos and terror within the very walls that were supposed to protect them. White captures the spiritual dimension of this madness with piercing clarity. The proud city was humbled, she writes. The oppressor became the instrument of God's wrath. This wasn't just military strategy gone wrong or political divisions getting out of hand. This was the inevitable outcome of persistent rebellion against divine law. When a society abandons the principles of justice, mercy, and truth, when leaders choose pride over humility and power over service, the result is not merely spiritual corruption. It manifests as real-world chaos, violence, and ultimately destruction. The year 70 CE arrived. Titus, now firmly in command, brought his legions to Jerusalem's walls during the Passover season, when the city was swollen with pilgrims from across Judea and beyond. What should have been a time of celebration and remembrance of God's deliverance became a trap. The pilgrims who had come to worship found themselves imprisoned by the very walls that were meant to protect them. Titus offered terms of surrender multiple times. He didn't want to destroy the temple. Roman policy generally respected local religions, and Titus understood that destroying such a sacred site would only fuel future resistance. But the factions inside Jerusalem couldn't agree even on surrender. The Zealots, controlling the Temple Mount, rejected any terms that would require them to lay down their arms. They believed that God would intervene, that he would send deliverance just as he had in the days of Hezekiah, when the Assyrian army was struck down at Jerusalem's gates. But they had forgotten something crucial. In Hezekiah's time, the king had humbled himself before God. He had sought divine guidance through the prophet Isaiah. He had repented of the nation's sins and called the people to do the same. The deliverance that came wasn't the reward for proud defiance. It was the response to humble faith and obedience. The Jerusalem of 70 CE was nothing like the Jerusalem of Hezekiah's time. This city had rejected its prophets. It had killed the one who came in God's name. It had chosen rebellion over repentance, pride over humility, violence over peace. And now, the consequences of those choices were about to unfold with terrible, inexorable force. The siege tightened like a noose. Titus built a wall completely surrounding the city, cutting off all escape and all supplies. What followed was one of the most horrific episodes in ancient history, documented in agonizing detail by Josephus, who watched it happen from the Roman camp. The famine inside Jerusalem became apocalyptic. People who had been wealthy found themselves fighting over scraps. The social order collapsed completely. Josephus describes scenes of mothers hiding food from their own children, of children snatching bread from their elderly parents, of the strong preying upon the weak in desperate competition for survival. Bodies began piling up in the streets because there weren't enough people with enough strength to bury them all. The factions within the city continued fighting each other, even as famine ravaged the population. John of Gisela's forces raided homes looking for hidden food, torturing anyone suspected of hoarding. Simon Bar Giorra's men did the same in the parts of the city they controlled. The very people who should have been defending Jerusalem from external threats were terrorizing their own citizens, adding human cruelty to the suffering imposed by the siege. Josephus records one incident that haunted the ancient world for centuries afterward, mentioned by historians as evidence of how completely humanity can break down under extreme pressure. A woman named Mary, driven mad by hunger, killed and ate her own infant child. When the smell of cooking meat drew soldiers to her house, she offered them portions, telling them what it was. Even hardened warriors were sickened. The news spread throughout the city and even to the Roman camp, and it became a symbol of how low Jerusalem had fallen. White doesn't shy away from these horrors. She presents them as evidence of what happens when divine guidance is persistently rejected. The destruction of Jerusalem was complete, she writes. Not one stone was left upon another. The sins of the nation had brought it to ruin, and the hand of God had executed the sentence, which could no longer be delayed. This raises a question that troubles many people when they encounter this story. How can a God of love permit such suffering? How can mercy and such judgment coexist? White addresses this by emphasizing that God doesn't cause human evil. What he does is withdraw his protecting hand when people persistently choose rebellion. The chaos, violence, and suffering in Jerusalem weren't divinely inflicted. They were the natural result of human choices made in the absence of divine restraint. Think about it this way. A parent sets boundaries for a child, not to restrict freedom, but to provide safety. When the child persistently rejects those boundaries, insisting on learning through experience rather than guidance, the parent eventually has to allow natural consequences to teach the lessons that loving instruction couldn't. The pain that results isn't because the parent wanted the child to suffer. It's because the child refused the protection that obedience would have provided. Jerusalem had been given every advantage. The Jewish people had received divine law, had been blessed with prophets, had been entrusted with oracles of God. They had seen miracles. They had been delivered from slavery in Egypt, sustained through wilderness wandering, given victory over enemies that outnumbered them. They knew what obedience brought and what rebellion cost, and still, generation after generation, they chose pride over humility, ritual over righteousness, nationalism over faithfulness to divine principles. The siege wore on for months. The Roman legions built ramps, brought battering rams, launched projectiles over the walls. Slowly, methodically, they broke down Jerusalem's defenses. The outer walls fell. The inner walls were breached. Street by street, building by building, the Romans advanced. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing they had nothing to lose. They launched raids on Roman positions. They tried to burn the siege engines. They fought hand to hand in the narrow streets where Roman discipline and superior numbers mattered less. But courage without food cannot sustain an army. Starvation had weakened them. Disease had thinned their ranks. The internal fighting had wasted their strength on fratricide rather than defense. Finally, in August of the year 70 CE, the Romans broke through to the Temple Mount. Josephus reports that Titus had given orders to preserve the temple if possible. He recognized its value as a symbol and didn't want to create a martyrdom site that would fuel future rebellions. But in the chaos of battle, a Roman soldier threw a burning torch through one of the temple windows. The flames caught. The cedar wood and tapestries ignited. Within hours, the temple that Herod had spent decades building, the successor to Solomon's temple, the place where the divine presence had dwelt among the people, was an inferno. The gold that adorned the temple melted in the intense heat, running down into the cracks between the stones. Later, in their greed to recover that gold, the Roman soldiers would pry apart every stone, literally fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another. White emphasizes the finality of this moment. The destruction wasn't just of a building, but of an entire system. The temple had been the center of Jewish worship. Without it, the sacrificial system ordained in the law of Moses could not continue. The priesthood lost its function. The annual festivals could no longer be celebrated as prescribed. In one catastrophic day, a religious system that had existed for over 1,000 years came to an abrupt end. The Romans showed no mercy in the final assault. They had lost men during the long siege. They had been frustrated by the stubborn resistance. Now they unleashed their fury. Josephus estimates that over 1 million people died during the siege and in the final massacre. While some historians question that number as possibly inflated, all agree that the death toll was staggering. Blood ran in the streets. Bodies were piled so high they blocked passageways. The survivors, those not killed outright, faced a fate that might have been worse than death. The Romans took thousands of captives. The strongest were reserved for the triumph Titus would hold in Rome, where they would be paraded as spoils of war before being executed or sold into slavery. The skilled craftsmen were sent to work on Roman building projects. The young and healthy were sent to the slave markets throughout the empire. The elderly and weak were simply killed, considered not worth the effort of transporting. Josephus himself walked through the ruins. He describes a city so completely destroyed that someone who had known it before would not have recognized the site. The magnificent buildings were rubble. The walls were cast down. The streets were choked with debris and corpses. The city that had been the pride of the Jewish nation, the center of their worship, the symbol of divine favor, was gone. Tacitus, writing from Rome, confirmed the completeness of the destruction. He notes that even hardened Roman soldiers, men who had seen battle across the empire, were shaken by what they witnessed in Jerusalem. The suffering, the death, the utter annihilation of a great city affected even those who had caused it. But amid all this horror, there was a remarkable fact. White emphasizes it because it demonstrates so clearly the principle she's illustrating throughout this narrative. Not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Those who obeyed the divine warnings were preserved, a living testimony of God's mercy. Think about that. In a city where over 1 million people died, where famine claimed thousands before the Romans even broke through the walls, where disease, violence, and war created death on an almost unimaginable scale. An entire community survived because they had obeyed a warning given decades earlier by a teacher most of the city had rejected and forgotten. The Christians who had fled to Pella heard about Jerusalem's fall. They mourned for their city, for the temple, for the people who had refused to heed the warning. But they also understood that they had witnessed the fulfillment of prophecy, the proof that the one they followed truly spoke with divine authority. Their faith had not been in vain. Their obedience had saved their lives. This preservation wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't favoritism. It was the natural result of obedience to divine guidance. God had provided a way of escape, clear instructions, and enough time to follow them. Those who believed and obeyed were saved. Those who rejected the warning perished. The principle was simple, stark, and absolutely just. White draws a parallel that runs throughout her work. She writes that the destruction of Jerusalem is a type of the final judgment. The same principles that operated then will operate at the end of time. God will warn. He will provide a way of escape. He will give clear instruction. Those who believe and obey will be preserved. Those who reject the warning will face the consequences of their choice. This isn't about God being harsh or unfeeling. It's about the nature of reality. Divine law isn't arbitrary. It's the expression of how the universe actually works. When we align ourselves with those principles, we experience blessing and protection. When we rebel against them, we experience the natural consequences of living out of harmony with reality itself. The fall of Jerusalem demonstrated this with unmistakable clarity. A city that should have been preserved by divine favor was destroyed. A people who should have been protected by their covenant relationship with God were scattered and enslaved. The temple that represented God's presence among his people was reduced to rubble. Why? Not because God is cruel, but because persistent rebellion makes protection impossible. You cannot be shielded from the consequences of choices you insist on making. The survivors who were scattered across the Roman Empire carried with them a painful lesson, but they also carried something precious. They carried the Hebrew scriptures. They carried knowledge of the law. They established synagogues in new cities. They continued teaching and studying, ensuring that divine truth would survive even though the temple and the nation had fallen. White sees providential purpose even in this scattering. The very scattering that seemed to extinguish a nation became the channel through which God's truth would spread to all the world. The faithful seed was preserved, that future generations might know the way of salvation. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in history. What looks like defeat from a human perspective often serves a larger divine purpose. Joseph sold into slavery in Egypt. The Israelites enslaved in Babylon. The Christians scattered by persecution in the book of Acts. Each time, what seemed like catastrophe became the means by which truth spread further than it could have otherwise. But this doesn't minimize the tragedy. The destruction of Jerusalem was real suffering, real death, real loss. The lesson isn't that tragedy is good. The lesson is that even in tragedy, even in judgment, divine purpose continues to unfold. Truth survives. The faithful are preserved. The story continues. Josephus lived for years after the fall of Jerusalem. He wrote his histories under Roman patronage, trying to explain to the Greco-Roman world who the Jews were and why this war had happened. His works, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, became some of the most important historical documents of the ancient world. Without them, we would know far less about this period. Without them, we would have much less historical confirmation of the biblical accounts. But Josephus wrote with a heavy heart. He had tried to prevent the war. He had counseled surrender, arguing that fighting Rome was suicide. He had seen his predictions come true in the most horrible way possible. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to find meaning in the ashes of his nation. White, writing with prophetic insight, provides that meaning. She frames the fall of Jerusalem not as a random tragedy of war, not as simply the victory of a stronger power over a weaker one, but as the working out of divine principles in human history. Justice, mercy, warning, choice, consequence. These are not just theological concepts. They are the operating system of reality itself. The history of Jerusalem is a mirror for all nations, White writes. God's law is immutable. His mercy is long-suffering, but persistent rebellion must result in disaster. This is a principle that applies not just to ancient Judea, but to every nation, every society, every institution that exists. Prosperity, power, and privilege do not exempt anyone from moral law. In fact, those who have received more have greater responsibility, and their judgment is correspondingly more severe. When they failed to live up to that responsibility, Jerusalem had every advantage. It had been chosen, it had been blessed, it had received divine revelation, it had been given prophet after prophet, warning after warning, chance after chance to turn back from the path it was on. And it refused, right up until the moment when the choice was no longer available, when the consequences became inevitable and unstoppable. White emphasizes that this pattern repeats. As the Jews rejected God's warnings, so the world will face the final calls of mercy. Those who heed the warnings will be saved. Those who mock them will face inevitable destruction. She's not speaking metaphorically here. She's describing what she sees as the certain future, based on the unchanging nature of divine principles. This makes the story of Jerusalem more than just history. It becomes a case study, a template, a warning for every generation that comes after. The question isn't whether the principles still apply. The question is whether we will learn from history or insist on repeating it. The survivors of Jerusalem's fall scattered across the Mediterranean world carried with them not just trauma, but also a profound understanding of what happens when divine warning is ignored. Some became Christians, finally recognizing in Jesus the fulfillment of prophecy they had once rejected. Others remained committed to traditional Judaism, establishing new centers of learning and worship in the diaspora. But none could forget. The memory of Jerusalem's fall became a defining moment in Jewish consciousness, shaping identity and faith for generations to come. The Romans, meanwhile, celebrated their victory. Titus returned to Rome in triumph. The Arch of Titus still stands today, depicting Roman soldiers carrying away the menorah and other treasures from the temple. It was meant to be a monument to Roman power, proof that no nation could successfully resist the empire. But it also became, unintentionally, a monument to fulfilled prophecy, physical evidence that Jesus' words had come true exactly as spoken. The religious leaders who had rejected Jesus, who had called for his crucifixion, who had persecuted his followers were gone. The temple they had controlled was destroyed. The political power they had jealously guarded was eliminated. The nation they had claimed to protect was scattered. Everything they had tried to preserve by rejecting Jesus was lost. Everything Jesus had warned would happen if they rejected him came to pass precisely as predicted. White points out that this wasn't vindictive. God took no pleasure in Jerusalem's destruction. Jesus had wept over the city, expressing genuine grief at what was coming. The door of mercy had remained open as long as possible. But ultimately, persistent rejection makes preservation impossible. You cannot save people who absolutely refuse to be saved. You cannot protect those who insist on embracing danger. The principle here is universal and applies at every level, from individual lives to entire civilizations. Choices have consequences. Small compromises accumulate into major departures from truth. Pride blinds us to danger. Rejection of divine guidance doesn't free us from divine law. It just leaves us unprotected when that law's consequences manifest. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss this as ancient history, relevant to its time, but not to ours. But White's entire purpose in recounting this story is to show that it's intensely relevant. The patterns that led to Jerusalem's fall are playing out in our world today. Nations that forget moral law, leaders who choose pride over service, societies that reject divine guidance in favor of human wisdom, religious institutions that value tradition and power more than truth and justice. The warning signs are there, just as they were for Jerusalem. The question is whether we'll recognize them, whether we'll heed them, whether we'll make different choices than Jerusalem made. History doesn't have to repeat itself, but it tends to when we refuse to learn from it. White's prophetic perspective allows her to see Jerusalem's destruction as more than an isolated historical event. She sees it as a demonstration of principles that are eternal, unchanging, and universally applicable. The history of Jerusalem presents the principles of God's government, the certainty of justice, and the unchanging nature of mercy. Every nation and every individual is tested by the same principles. This is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it means we cannot escape the consequences of our choices. We cannot mock divine principles and expect to avoid the natural results of living in opposition to reality. But it's also hopeful because it means mercy is still available, protection is still possible, and obedience still brings blessing. The faithful who fled Jerusalem didn't do so because they were smarter or better than their neighbors. They fled because they believed a specific warning and chose to obey it, even when obedience looked foolish. That's faith in its purest form. Not blind belief, but trust that leads to action, even costly action, based on revelation. This is what White calls readers to in every generation. Not mere intellectual assent to truth, but practical obedience that shapes real choices in real situations. Faith that just agrees with correct doctrine but doesn't change behavior isn't faith at all. It's just religious opinion. True faith shows itself in obedience, especially when that obedience requires sacrifice. The Christians who left Jerusalem sacrificed everything: their homes, their businesses, their status in the community, the familiarity of the place where their families had lived for generations. They became refugees because they trusted a warning more than they trusted appearances, and that trust saved their lives. Today, divine guidance still calls people to choices that look foolish by worldly standards, to forgive when the world says to seek revenge, to show mercy when the world demands justice, to serve when the world values domination, to be humble when the world celebrates pride, to speak truth when the world rewards comfortable lies. These aren't just nice religious ideas. They're the path of safety in a world that's still governed by the same principles that governed ancient Jerusalem. White emphasizes that the desolation of Jerusalem was a warning to the world. Mercy had been extended, judgment had been delayed, yet the consequences of sin could no longer be avoided. Let all take heed and turn to God while there is time. This urgency in her writing isn't meant to create fear for its own sake. It's meant to awaken people to reality before it's too late to choose differently. The fall of Jerusalem teaches us that time doesn't run forever. There comes a moment when the door of mercy closes, not because God arbitrarily shuts it, but because the consequences of our choices become unavoidable. Jerusalem had decades to respond to Jesus' warning, decades to recognize the signs, decades to change course. But each day of delay made the eventual reckoning more certain, more severe, more inescapable. This is true in personal lives as well as in national destinies. The addiction we keep meaning to address, the relationship we keep meaning to repair, the truth we keep meaning to face, the change we keep meaning to make. Every delay makes the eventual confrontation more difficult, the consequences more severe, the path back more painful. Jerusalem's story is a warning that postponing obedience is ultimately choosing rebellion, because eventually the opportunity to choose will pass. But even in the darkest elements of this story, there's a thread of hope that White consistently highlights. Even in judgment, mercy finds a way. The Christians were preserved. The scriptures survived. Truth continued. The story didn't end with destruction. It continued through those who had obeyed, those who had believed, those who had trusted divine guidance over human wisdom. This is the pattern throughout history. Noah and his family preserved through the flood. Lot rescued from Sodom. The Israelites protected by the Passover lamb. Daniel preserved in the lion's den. The 3 Hebrews untouched by the furnace. Again and again, judgment falls, but the faithful are protected. Not because they're perfect, but because they've aligned themselves with divine principles through faith and obedience. The destruction of Jerusalem also marked a significant shift in the history of Christianity. With the temple destroyed and Judaism scattered, the early Christians faced a choice. Would they remain a sect within Judaism, or would they emerge as a distinct faith? The fall of Jerusalem essentially decided that question. The Christian movement spread throughout the Gentile world, no longer centered in Jerusalem, no longer tied to the temple system, becoming truly universal in scope. Paul, who had died just a few years before Jerusalem fell, had argued passionately that salvation wasn't tied to Jewish ritual or temple worship. He had insisted that faith in Christ was the only requirement, that Gentiles didn't need to become Jews to become Christians. Many Jewish Christians had disagreed, arguing that the law of Moses still applied. The destruction of the temple made that debate moot. The old system was gone. The new covenant that Jesus had announced at the Last Supper was now the only covenant that mattered. White sees this too as providential. Though Jerusalem was destroyed, the kingdom of God moved forward. The gospel wasn't dependent on a physical temple or a particular nation. It was a universal message for all humanity, and the scattering of believers actually accelerated its spread. What looked like catastrophe from one angle was opportunity from another. This doesn't mean the destruction was good. The loss of life was tragic. The suffering was real. The judgment was severe. But even in judgment, even in tragedy, divine purpose continued to unfold. This is a mystery that's difficult for human minds to fully grasp. How can something be both judgment and opportunity? How can destruction serve a larger purpose without making the destruction itself good? White doesn't claim to fully explain this paradox, but she consistently points to it throughout her writings. God's ways are not our ways. He can bring good out of evil without being responsible for the evil. He can use human rebellion to accomplish his purposes without endorsing the rebellion. He can judge sin while still loving sinners. These tensions exist in the nature of reality itself, and they're on full display in the fall of Jerusalem. The eyewitnesses to Jerusalem's destruction carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Josephus wrote his histories partly to process his own trauma, to make sense of what he'd seen. The Christian survivors told their children and grandchildren about the warning they'd heeded, about the faith that had saved them. The Jewish refugees scattered across the empire established new communities, adapted their worship to life without a temple, and preserved their identity despite losing their homeland. Each group drew different lessons from the same events. For Josephus and traditional Jews, it was a catastrophe that called for mourning and adaptation. For Christians, it was confirmation that Jesus had truly spoken with divine authority, that prophecy had been fulfilled, that they had been right to trust his words. For Romans, it was proof of their military superiority and the futility of resisting imperial power. But White argues that there's a deeper lesson that transcends all these perspectives. The fall of Jerusalem reveals fundamental truths about how reality works, about the nature of divine justice, about the relationship between human choice and divine sovereignty, about the inevitability of consequences when moral law is violated. These truths aren't culturally relative. They don't change based on era or geography. They're as applicable in the 21st century as they were in the 1st century. The details differ. The specific circumstances vary, but the underlying principles remain constant because they're built into the fabric of creation itself. Nations today face the same choices Jerusalem faced. Will we build our security on military might or on moral integrity? Will we trust in human wisdom or seek divine guidance? Will we respond to warnings or ignore them until it's too late? Will we humble ourselves before truth or let pride lead us to destruction? Leaders today face the same tests Jerusalem's leaders faced. Will they serve the people or exploit them? Will they pursue justice or preserve their own power? Will they speak truth even when it's unpopular or tell comforting lies to maintain their position? Will they recognize their accountability to moral law or act as though they're above it? Individuals today face the same choice the residents of Jerusalem faced when the Christians fled to Pella. Will we trust divine revelation even when it contradicts conventional wisdom? Will we obey warnings even when obedience looks foolish? Will we sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term safety? Will we align ourselves with eternal principles or go along with whatever the crowd is doing? White's genius is in showing how a specific historical event illuminates timeless truths. She doesn't just recount what happened, she explains why it happened, what it reveals about divine principles, and how those principles continue to operate in our world today. The fall of Jerusalem isn't just a story. It's a lens through which we can understand our own times, our own choices, our own destinies. The Christian community that survived Jerusalem's fall became the seed from which the global church grew. They carried the gospel to Asia Minor, to Greece, to Rome itself. They faced persecution, martyrdom, and countless challenges. But they persevered because they had learned something crucial from Jerusalem's fall. Divine warnings are always accurate. Divine promises are always reliable. Obedience always brings protection, even when protection looks different than we expected. This is a lesson each generation must learn for itself. We can read about it in history books, but until we face the choice ourselves, until we have to decide whether to trust divine guidance over human reasoning, the lesson remains theoretical. Jerusalem's story challenges us to decide in advance. When the moment comes, when obedience requires sacrifice, when faith demands action that looks foolish to the world, what will we choose? The residents of Jerusalem made their choices. The Christians who fled to Pella made theirs. History recorded the results with brutal clarity. One group survived, the other perished. The difference wasn't intelligence, social status, military strength, or religious pedigree. The difference was simply obedience to divine warning. White's retelling of Jerusalem's fall serves multiple purposes in her larger work. It establishes the pattern of warning and judgment that she sees repeating throughout history. It demonstrates that prophecy is reliable, that divine warnings come true precisely as spoken. It shows that even in the darkest judgments, mercy provides a way of escape for those willing to take it. And it sets the stage for understanding the final events of Earth's history, which she sees as following the same pattern on a global scale. The great controversy between good and evil, between Christ and Satan, between truth and error, plays out in human history. Jerusalem's fall was one chapter in that larger story. It wasn't the beginning, and it certainly wasn't the end. But it was a crucial chapter, a pivotal moment that demonstrated with unmistakable clarity what happens when divine guidance is rejected and what happens when it's obeyed. For modern readers, the message is both warning and invitation. Warning because the same principles still operate, the same consequences still follow rebellion, the same judgment still awaits persistent rejection of truth. But invitation because mercy still extends, protection still awaits those who obey, and it's never too late to choose differently until that moment when time runs out. Jerusalem thought it had more time. It thought the warnings were exaggerated, that surely things wouldn't get that bad, that somehow they'd find a way through without having to make the difficult choices obedience required. They were wrong. Time ran out. The judgment fell. The consequences became unavoidable. White writes with urgency because she sees the same pattern unfolding in the modern world, not identical in every detail, but similar in principle. Nations rejecting moral guidance, leaders choosing pride over service, religious institutions valuing tradition over truth, individuals postponing obedience, assuming there will always be more time to get right with God. But the lesson of Jerusalem is that time doesn't extend forever. There comes a point of no return, a moment when the door of mercy closes, not arbitrarily, but as the natural result of persistent choice. Jerusalem reached that point. The question White poses to every reader is, have we learned from their mistake, or are we repeating it? The survivors who fled to Pella lived with the knowledge that they had been saved by obedience. They had looked foolish to their neighbors. They had sacrificed security and comfort. They had trusted a warning that contradicted everything the world around them was saying. And they had been proven right in the most definitive way possible. Everyone who stayed died. Everyone who left lived. The results couldn't have been clearer. This became part of their testimony, part of how they explained their faith to others. They didn't just believe abstract theological propositions. They had experienced divine protection through obedience. They had seen prophecy fulfilled. They had witnessed the consequences of rebellion and the blessing of faith. Their message carried the weight of lived experience, not just inherited tradition. White emphasizes that this is the most powerful testimony, not just knowing about God, but having experienced His faithfulness personally, not just believing in divine providence theoretically, but having been preserved by it practically. The Christians who survived Jerusalem's fall carried a testimony that couldn't be argued away or dismissed as mere opinion. As the first century drew to a close, the survivors aged and died, but they passed their testimony to the next generation. They told their children about Jerusalem's fall, about the warning they'd heeded, about the faith that had saved them. They ensured that the lesson wouldn't be forgotten, that future Christians would understand the importance of obedience, the reliability of prophecy, and the certainty of divine justice. This transmission of testimony is crucial. Each generation must learn the lessons of history, must understand the principles that govern reality, must choose for themselves whether to trust divine guidance or rely on human wisdom. The story of Jerusalem provides a case study, a concrete historical example that illustrates abstract spiritual principles in ways that are impossible to ignore. White's work continues this transmission of testimony. She's taking events that happened centuries ago and showing their relevance to modern readers. She's demonstrating that the principles that operated then still operate now. She's warning that the patterns that led to judgment in the past will lead to judgment in the present if we follow them. And she's inviting readers to make the choice that leads to protection, blessing, and life, rather than the choice that leads to destruction. The fall of Jerusalem stands as one of history's clearest demonstrations of divine justice and mercy operating simultaneously. Justice because rebellion had to be judged, because consequences had to follow choices, because moral law couldn't be violated indefinitely without results. Mercy because warning was given, because time to respond was provided, because a way of escape was offered to all who would take it. This dual nature of divine character, justice, and mercy held together is sometimes difficult for human minds to grasp. We tend to emphasize one at the expense of the other. We want either pure mercy with no consequences or pure justice with no compassion. But reality, as Jerusalem's story demonstrates, involves both. Mercy extends as long as possible. Justice falls when mercy is exhausted. And throughout it all, divine providence ensures that truth survives, that the faithful are preserved, that the story continues. The ruins of Jerusalem became, in a sense, a monument to these principles. For centuries afterward, people could visit the site and see the fulfillment of prophecy with their own eyes. They could see that not one stone had been left upon another, exactly as Jesus had predicted. They could walk through the desolation and understand viscerally what happens when divine warning is ignored. Today, Jerusalem stands rebuilt, a thriving modern city and a center of 3 major world religions. But the lesson of its first century fall remains. The physical city was rebuilt, but the spiritual principles demonstrated in its destruction are eternal. They apply to every city, every nation, every institution, and every individual that exists. White's purpose in recounting this history is ultimately practical. She's not just interested in what happened, but in what it means for us today. She's not writing as a detached historian, but as a prophet calling people to pay attention, to learn from the past, to make choices that align with divine principles before it's too late. The desolation of Jerusalem is a type of the final judgment, she writes. The principles that brought ruin to the city will operate wherever sin is cherished and mercy is despised. This is the heart of her message. Jerusalem's fall isn't just history, it's prophecy. It's a template for understanding what will happen at the end of time, when the same principles will operate on a global scale. But just as there was mercy for those who obeyed in Jerusalem, there will be mercy for those who obey in the final crisis. Just as the Christians were preserved by following divine guidance, so the faithful will be preserved at the end. The pattern doesn't change. Trust and obey, and you'll be protected. Rebel and ignore warnings, and you'll face consequences. This isn't presented as manipulation or threat. It's simply the statement of how reality works. Divine law isn't arbitrary. It's the description of reality itself. Aligning with it brings blessing. Fighting against it brings destruction. The choice is genuinely ours, but the consequences of our choices are determined by principles we didn't create and can't change. As we conclude this journey through Jerusalem's fall, White invites us to reflection, not just thinking about ancient history, but examining our own lives, our own choices, our own responses to divine guidance. Are we like Jerusalem, proud and confident in our own strength, dismissing warnings as irrelevant? Or are we like the Christians who fled to Pella, willing to look foolish in the world's eyes if it means obeying divine instruction? The story of Jerusalem is complete. Its destiny was determined by choices made long ago. But our story is still being written. Our choices are still ahead of us. The principles remain the same, but the opportunity to respond to them is still available. For now. White's urgency comes from her conviction that this opportunity won't last forever. Time is running out, not because God is impatient, but because human choices are reaching their inevitable conclusions. The desolation of Jerusalem was a warning to the world. Mercy had been extended, judgment had been delayed, yet the consequences of sin could no longer be avoided. Let all take heed and turn to God while there is time. This is White's final appeal to her readers. Learn from Jerusalem. Don't repeat its mistakes. Heed the warnings. Choose obedience. Trust divine guidance even when it contradicts human wisdom. And do it now, while the choice is still available, while mercy still extends, while time remains. The story of Jerusalem challenges us. It warns us. It instructs us. But ultimately, it invites us to a different path than the one Jerusalem took, to humility instead of pride, to obedience instead of rebellion, to faith instead of presumption, to life instead of death. The great controversy between good and evil continues. Jerusalem was one battlefield in that larger war. The principles demonstrated there continue to operate in our world, in our nations, in our communities, in our individual lives. The question isn't whether these principles are real. History has proven that beyond doubt. The question is whether we'll align ourselves with them or against them, whether we'll learn from Jerusalem's example or ignore it, whether we'll be preserved like the Christians who fled, or destroyed like the city that refused to hear. If you've made it this far in this journey through history, I want to thank you. This isn't an easy story. It's not comfortable. It challenges our assumptions and confronts us with hard truths about human nature, divine justice, and the consequences of our choices. But it's a story that needs to be told, needs to be heard, needs to be learned from. Ellen G. White's retelling of Jerusalem's fall in the Great Controversy is more than just history. It's prophecy, warning, instruction, and invitation all woven together. It shows us what has been so we can understand what is and prepare for what will be. It demonstrates that divine principles are real, that prophecy is reliable, that obedience brings protection, and that rebellion leads to ruin. As you go about your life after hearing this story, I hope you'll carry these lessons with you. When you face choices between convenience and obedience, remember Jerusalem. When you're tempted to dismiss divine guidance because it seems unreasonable, remember the Christians who fled to Pella. When you wonder whether prophecy is real or whether divine warnings should be taken seriously, remember that not one stone was left upon another, exactly as predicted. The fall of Jerusalem teaches us that history isn't random. It's governed by principles. Those principles reward obedience and punish rebellion, extend mercy and execute judgment, preserve the faithful and allow the consequences of persistent choice to fall on the rebellious. These aren't just religious ideas. They're descriptions of how reality actually works. And that makes this ancient story urgently relevant today. We live in times that in many ways mirror the days before Jerusalem fell. Pride, rebellion, rejection of moral guidance, confidence in human strength, dismissal of warnings. The patterns are repeating. The question is whether we'll recognize them in time to choose differently. White's work calls us to that recognition, to that choice, to that different path. Not because she wants to scare us, but because she wants to save us. Not because judgment is her focus, but because mercy is. She tells Jerusalem's story because she doesn't want our story to end the same way. If you found this exploration meaningful, if it challenged you or made you think, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment letting me know what resonated with you, what challenged you, what you'll carry with you from Jerusalem's story. History echoes. Patterns repeat. Principles endure. Jerusalem fell because it ignored warnings, rejected truth, and chose pride over humility. But some were saved because they believed, obeyed, and trusted divine guidance over human wisdom. The same choice stands before us. The same principles operate. The same consequences